All right. Welcome everybody to another session of the online Peace Science Colloquium. If you're tuning in for the first time, this colloquium is an online speaker series that's associated with the Peace Science Society International. I co-organize, my name is Brad Smith, and I co-organize this with Chelsea Estancona, who's an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. Today we have a really great presentation of a paper with a great title. It's How to Smuggle Contraband and Influence Border Policy. Written by Afiq bin Oslan. He's a PhD candidate at WashU St. Louis. And we have three wonderful discussants who are experts on a variety of related topics to the paper that Afiq is going to be presenting. So we have Chris Blair. He's an assistant professor of politics at Princeton University. We have Martin Castillo. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at NYU. And we have Ben Feigenberg, who's an associate professor of economics at University of Illinois, Chicago. So format is pretty straightforward. So I'll turn it over to Afiq now, and he'll give us about a 15-minute presentation. Then we'll have some discussion, and we'll try to wrap up around 11. Afiq, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brad. Let's make sure everyone is seeing the presentation. Excellent. So hi, everyone. Thank you, Brad, for inviting me to this opportunity, and thank you for all the panelists for volunteering their time once again at the end of the semester. Not sure how busy you are, but I'm sure you're not busy. So thank you very much. And I would like to present my paper titled How to Smuggle Contraband and Influence Border Policy. First and foremost, I should acknowledge this is a formal theory paper, but for those of you who have mild allergies to formal theory, perhaps I can promise you that this will be slightly more palatable than perhaps some formal theory talks you've seen, or at least I will endeavor my best to do so. So hopefully that'll be what it'll be like. So with a paper with a title like mine, inevitably it brings up images of, let's say, the drugs trade or the arms trade or human trafficking. And while I do intend for the content of the paper to speak to big issues such as those, I would also intend for it to speak to much more mundane issues, right? So for example, I'd like to talk about, to motivate the paper, an example to do with cattle smuggling, which occurs at the border between India and Bangladesh. So the border between India and Bangladesh is a very turbulent border for all sorts of reasons. And one of the reasons that creates this instability is the fact that, as we all know, India is a majority Hindu nation, whilst Bangladesh is a majority Muslim nation. Because cattle are sacred in the Hindu religion, there are a lot fewer things you can do with cattle on the market in India compared to what you can do with them in Bangladesh. This imbalance, this disparity in circumstances creates a lucrative opportunity for Indian cattle farmers to sell their cattle across the border in Bangladesh for much higher prices than they would get in the local Indian markets. So, and this creates opportunity for cattle smuggling, right? So in as the image shows, the Indian cattle farmers would wait for a dark, cloudy night. They bring their cattle over to the river that demarcates the border, put them on rafts, and float them across so that they can sell them across the border in Bangladesh for a greater profit. This cattle smuggling forms one of the great headaches of Indian Border Security Force. And over the past 20 or so years, although there has been some sort of walls and fences on the border between India and Bangladesh since about the 60s, over the past 20 or so years, there's been a noted effort by the Indian Border Security Force to increase the amount of border outposts built at this border. And they've explicitly stated that cattle smuggling is one of the reasons that has motivated the decision here. And this, of course, this phenomenon of rather mundane products, here being cattle, causing great border security headaches is not exclusive to this border between India and Bangladesh. Of course, there are also cases such as the cigarettes being smuggled out of China or luxury electronics smuggling to Argentina. And all of these things are typical mundane objects you see in everyday houses, goes through a very interesting process in getting there from their point of origin. One of the questions I hope my paper can speak to is to answer whether or not the solutions the Indian government and these other governments have taken to address illicit trade at their borders is actually effective. Fun fact, out of all the borders that have been fortified meaning there's been some sort of wall, fencing, moat, trenches, whatever at the border, since the year 1800, almost half of them, over 40% of all of these fortified borders, were actually built in the past 20 years. So focus on border policies are actually a relatively recent phenomenon, both in terms of the decisions made by policymakers, but also in terms of the attention given to it by the average citizen, which I think if you are living in the United States over the past few years, you may have noticed on your own. To complement this general interest in border politics from the general public and from politicians, academics have also, of course, turned their attention to this topic, as my panel will no doubt already know. As you can see, here's a selection of papers on this particular topic. You will notice that the years are very, very recent. And out of these different ways of looking at border politics, I will zoom in on one particular approach, that is the economic approach, right? So economic factors that influence the decision for states to take certain policies at their borders. This literature is small but growing, and broadly speaking, their argument is that economic instability is the main predictor of states deciding to harden or soften their borders. And this economic instability might be something like what I just described earlier, where there's some sort of imbalance in how the markets work, or it might be more things like income inequality on either side, or disparities in the labor markets. However, the bulk of the papers that have come in this particular segment of papers on border politics, the economic segment, has largely focused on the economic dynamics between the two states, or between the states and the citizens living in that borderland. And as I hope to have convinced you with the stories earlier in the talk, these are not the only important actors that we have to be concerned about. And one other actor that might be important is illicit actors. In the literature, this is sometimes called clandestine international actors, but that's a whole mouthful. And even if you initialize it, it becomes CIA, which is not very helpful. So in the paper, with a bit of rhetorical flourish, I call them bandits. We know from existing empirical work that fortifying the border does indeed affect bandit activity. However, political science has, in my opinion, lacked sufficient theory on this dynamic, right? Compared to, say, what economics might have to say about illicit actors, or even about criminology has to say about illicit actors, political science's view on this is can be slightly shallow. So this is what I would like to add here with my paper. In this paper, I argue that bandits are strategic actors. And by that, I mean the very, very simple thing is that under some conditions, bandits might not commit to the full range of possible activities today in order to deter the states from taking action against them. So the bandits might not extract everything they can from the economy today, because in doing so, they might trigger the state into acting against them. And by self-moderating today, they have the opportunity to ensure that in the future, they can still continue their banditry, and thus trading away short-term benefits for long-term gain. Next, I will, as I mentioned, this is a formal theory paper, so I will go over the game. What happens, the next part of the presentation, I'll go through relatively quickly because it's the structure of the game. After I talk through the structure, there will be a rather slightly more informative diagram where I will slow down and point to the structure once again. So if you'll bear with me while I talk through the more technical things, we will be clear at the end. So the game will be an infinite horizon game, played between a state, a representative, one of the states at the border, and a representative bandit. I can talk about later if anyone's interested in what happens if there are more than one state or more than one bandit in the problem. But for now, we'll start with a single state and a representative bandit. The bandit can be of two potential types. They can be of high type or low type. These types represent the strength of the bandit. So, and the strength of the bandit correlates to how effective state policies are in constraining them. And bandits are high type with probability P. I divide the game into two separate subgames, or two separate histories, and I call these the unfortified history and the fortified history. In the unfortified history, this is where the game starts. So it denotes that there's been no policy choice yet made by the state. And when there's been no policy enacted by the very first thing that happens in this state, is the very first thing that happens in history, that the state can choose either to enact policy to fortify the border, or to not enact the policy to not fortify the border. After the state makes the decision, the choice to fortify the border, the choice to enact the policy incurs the state a one-time cost of K. After the state has chosen the policy, if the border persists as having no fortifications, no policy is enacted, then the bandit has the opportunity to choose how much they extract out of the economy, right? How much bandit activity they get up to. And when there is no policy in place, this choice range is from the full unit interval 0 to 1, and I label this choice as X. As soon as the state has chosen at any time to enact the policy to fortify the game, the game moves to the fortified history. In the fortified history, the state no longer has the choice to make. So what this means, of course, is that the state choice of the policy is one-time and permanent and has no upkeep costs. And I can talk about the nuances of that game design later on if anyone's interested, both from a substantive and a technical perspective. From a technical perspective, it doesn't matter too much. And I do think substantively it's palatable, and I can expand on that later. But the more important part in the fortified history is that it changes the choice set of the bandits, right? Before in unfortified history, the bandit can choose from the full range of the unit interval 0 to 1. But when the game is fortified, their ability to extract has been limited now from 0 to theta sub tau, where this theta is higher for high types than it is for low types. So the policy the state chooses is more effective at restraining the low types and the high types, reflecting the different strengths that these two types of bandits have. Payoffs in the game are incredibly simple. The bandits get exactly what they extract, so x sub t, and the state gets what remains 1 minus x sub t. And if the state chooses to fortify in any particular period, that they pay the cost k. So I have a problem here when I want to design the game, right? So I want to design the game in such a way that when the state chooses their policy, the policy is successful at constraining bandit activity. This means that I have to have the game be that policy choice operates before illicit activity. However, at the same time, I would like it so that the state can look at the illicit activity operated by the bandits, and from that be informed as to what choices of border policy is actually the best choice in the particular circumstance they face in. So I need both for policy choice to come before activity, but I also want activity to come before policy choice. If you're familiar with formal models, the result of this is fairly obvious. It is the motivation behind the design, why I've chosen to do an infinite horizon game, and the structure of the game overall looks like this. So in the very beginning, nature decides the bandit type. So with one scan property P, they are a high type, and it moves into the start of the game, the red loop, which is the unfortified history, where at the very start, the state can choose the border policy. And if they choose not to enact any policy, then the bandit gets to choose extraction level from the full unit interval 0 to 1, and the game repeats back to the next period where the state can choose their policy. If the state chooses to enact the policy, if they choose to fortify their borders, the game moves to this blue loop down here. And once they're in the blue loop, the state no longer has a choice to make, and it's only the bandit who is making the choice, which is what level to extract. And in this particular branch of the game, the extraction is limited to 0 to theta, where theta is higher for type H than for type L. So that's the broad structure of the game. While we are on the visualization, I would like to quickly work through some the intuitions of the results that I obtain out of this game. So broadly, I look at two different types of results. One I call reactive equilibria, the other I call preemptive equilibria. And the names of these types of equilibria kind of reveal what I intend to study here. So I will focus on this shorter presentation mostly on the reactive equilibria. So in a reactive equilibria, when the game starts and the state has the opportunity to choose the policy in the very first period, the state will say, wait a minute, I don't have enough information, therefore I am going to wait. No matter what, I'm going to wait for the bandit to choose some extraction level in the first period, and then in the second period, use the information to decide what sorts of border policies are appropriate. Hence, they are reacting to bandit choice. This policy has its advantages, of course, because this approach has its advantages because the state can wait to see what exactly the bandit gets up to, and then choose the appropriate policy in response. However, it also has inefficiencies because for two reasons. One is that the state has to wait, and this process of waiting generates inefficiencies because it passes the initiative down to the bandits, right? So for one period, for the initial period of the game, the state says, I'm not going to do anything, you can do whatever you want. And hence, they lose out in this first period if the bandit performs high levels of extractive activity, right? If the bandit wreaks lots of havoc in the economy in the first period. That's one inefficiency of the reactive equilibria. The second inefficiency of the reactive equilibria is exactly the strategy I alluded to earlier, right? So the purpose of this model is to study the possibility that bandits can be strategic. And one way in which bandits can be strategic is they can obfuscate their type. So if the state waits to learn the types of the bandit has, during their decision-making, might say, wait a minute, if I reveal my type, the state will in the next period might enact policy to restrain me in a future period. So it might be in my strategic interest to restrain myself and not reveal my type, so the state cannot effectively choose border policy in the next period. So this other inefficiency here stems from the ability of the bandit to make a strategic choice to limit themselves, obfuscate the type, and then prevent the state from effectively choosing policies. While the bandit does lose out in the short term by limiting themselves, in the long term, this is actually beneficial for the bandits and disadvantageous for the state, because limiting myself today for the bandit means I get to extract more in the future because I prevent the state from enacting the policy. And that's the reactive equilibria. The other equilibria is related to is the preemptive equilibria, where immediately the state, rather than waiting to learn, does the opposite. It immediately gambles and immediately chooses to fortify and move the game immediately to the blue loop. This obviously isn't efficient, because sometimes if you just gamble without waiting for further information, you get things wrong. So both the preemptive equilibria and the reactive equilibria have their own inefficiencies. I went through that. I don't know if I went through that fast or if I repeated myself a lot, but hopefully that's clear to some people. I will now move a little bit slower and talk about the main punchline, the shorter presentation, which is that strategic opportunity for the bandit, with a little bit more formal language. So in the game, the social concept I use is perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And as I mentioned, the bandits may have an incentive to limit their activity to dissuade the state from fortifying. This limited level, is found when the state is indifferent between their choices, right? And the state is indifferent between fortify, not fortify. And with some algebra, we put that together. We get this equation X star, which describes the limited level of extraction that the bandits will take if they want to dissuade the state. Just to quickly describe the characteristics of this X star. So the two things I want to point out is that X star, according to this equation, if you squint, but I won't give you time to do so, X star is always greater than theta sub L. Therefore, the low type bandit will never want to moderate themselves because, the low type bandit will always want to moderate themselves because X star is always greater than theta L. Therefore, the moderating themselves is always better than encouraging the state to fortify. However, X star may or may not be higher than theta H, right? Depending on the other parameters. So if you're a high type bandit, if you're a strong bandit, sometimes moderating is good for you, because sometimes moderating gives you more than what you would get if the state does enact that policy in the future. However, sometimes it is not beneficial, right? The opportunity to extract immediately at the first opportunity is too lucrative for you to ignore, and therefore you will reveal your type. This leads us to two separate branches of the reactive equilibria. So the first one is where the high type does feel like pooling. So where obfuscation is beneficial for the high type, so they will pretend to be a low type. This leads to a pooling equilibrium, where both the high type and the low type will play X star. And if the opportunity to extract is too lucrative, then the high type bandits will immediately go and say, well, I'm going to separate out anyway. I'm going to extract as much as possible in the first period, revealing their type, and therefore allowing the state to make the correct policy choice in the second period. That's the punchline for this short presentation. There are a few other things. There are lots of other things in the paper, which I will just wave at. So there is the preemptive equilibria I just said earlier, which where the state just gambles without learning. This has its own inefficiencies because you gamble, therefore you get things wrong sometimes. In a longer talk, we'd have gone back to the examples and talk about whether or not the model evaluates the state choices as good or bad. And one question I often get about this paper is what happens when you have more than one bandit? Long story short, my results still work. However, it requires lots of assumptions with regards to how bandits work together, how they cooperate, how they don't cooperate. And so while it does work, if you disagree with some of these assumptions, something which I think are fair, but I think some people think are not fair, which is not a non-controversial position to take, then it breaks down a little bit. If you consider things like bandits monitoring each other, or the sequence of choices, or the timing in which all the bandits make the decisions. So it kind of works, but you have to trust me on it. And that's mostly it. In summary, I would like to say, if there's anything you remember, what I pointed out today, border policy is about future threat, not past history. It's about what might happen in the future with regards to your economic interests, not about what happened in the past. Sometimes it's the same thing, but sometimes it is not, depending on whether or not there is an incentive to strategically obfuscate. So, and because of this uncertainty, because of the possibility of strategy, because of the nuances of private information, there is no real optimal border policy in the face of these circumstances, right? Both the preemptive option and the reactive options have their own drawbacks. And I hope to have pointed out how by simply adding a small nuanced understanding of one of the actors, giving the opportunity for illicit actors to do a bit of strategy, we've revealed something interesting about states' policy choices. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Afiq. So, okay, so before we turn it over to the discussants, Afiq, I'll ask you if you could say just like a few words about where you are with the paper, what kind of feedback would be most useful at this stage.
So this paper I've brought around a lot this semester, and hence, as a result, I do have like a pile of comments I should eventually start getting to work through. And I guess like I'm at the moment faced with sort of like decision paralysis, right? Which ones to prioritize, which ones are should to discount. So what's most valuable for me at the moment, I think, is to hear your frank thoughts. And then upon hearing your frank thoughts, like the ones I've heard before a few times, like, oh, okay, clearly they have a point because another smart person has said it. So that seems worthy of going forward. And if anything you do say here doesn't echo some of the other comments I've had, then maybe that's can be my excuse to discount some of those. So yeah, I would like to hear what do you think, and then what do you think deserves most attention, so that I can know what to focus on next with the next revision of this draft.
Great. And if you could undo the screen share, we'll get to discussant comments. So we'll go in alphabetical order by panelist last name. And so if each of our panelists, I'm just going to turn it over to you all. Take about 5 minutes, just kind of download your comments. And then once we've got that, we'll give Afiq a chance to respond. And then with the time left over, we'll have a, sort of like a conversation among the group. Also, we have a couple people in the audience. If you have any comments that you want to pass along to Afiq, you can enter them in the chat. And if there's time, I'll pass them along. And if not, we'll give them to him afterwards. So Chris, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. I'm a big fan of the OPSC. I've presented in it. I've discussed for it before. So really happy to see some more border related work showing up here. And I think that the formal theory angle is a useful contribution here. A lot of the recent work on border security in IR has been cross-national quant stuff. Maybe some very new work is like micro level data stuff, but I think the formal theory angle is really useful. Other than the Acharya and Lee piece that you cite, there I'm not familiar with too much. So I was really encouraged about that, and I think like the broad setup of the paper is really nice. So kudos to you, Afiq, and I think it'll emerge as a really good job market paper. So that's the preface. The first question that I had as I was reading through the paper, and this is something that you touch on early on, like the difference between bandits and civilians. And you mentioned that when bandits are extracting wealth from local communities, it's kind of leaving the system, whereas exchange among civilians is still accessible for the state to profit off of because of economic exchange and the possibility of taxation and things like that. But this raises this question for me about the very many places in the global south where the state lacks legibility, particularly in its borderlands, and so likely potentially has an inability to tax and administer civilian populations or to benefit from exchange among civilians in these kind of borderland communities. I mean, Afghanistan is like a kind of paramount case, but I think we can think of many settings in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, where the state has very weak capacity at the border, and so if the local civilian economy and the bandit economy are synonymous, civilians are like integrated into this kind of bandit-led market exchange. I was interested in how that would change like some of the dynamics of the model. And then also like related to this point, what if bandit wealth doesn't really leave the system because state border guards and state officials are corrupt, and instead of just kind of like monopolizing the wealth that they can extract, the bandits instead are kind of colluding with at least some subset of the border security apparatus in the state, whether or not there's fortification. or not. And I think, like, again, that corruption angle and the sort of like legibility angle are two things that I was intrigued to hear more about, because I think that they characterize like a high of the borders in the global south, which is probably where like these sorts of dynamics are most relevant. Although you're right that, you know, I fully recognize the you know, the kind of Carter and Post, Hausner and Wittenberg finding about wealth inequalities at the border, and obviously there's smuggling in the global north as well. But that was the first sort of thing I wanted to hear some thoughts on. Second, I was intrigued by this self-moderation idea. I think a case study would be really nice to point to some clear, you know, evidence of a bandit organization that was engaged in self-moderation. You know, you have recurrent references to some of the cartels in Mexico, but I didn't think any of them really, at least for me, fully kind of like definitively suggested that they were engaged in self-moderation of economic extraction. I think you do show in the paper that like the cartels self-limited violence, but you know, maybe a case on the India-Bangladesh border or something like that, which is a sort of motivating example at the start, could be nice to help kind of underscore the realistic possibility that self-moderation occurs, you know, in the wild and not just something that you drew up in the model. I also was wondering if self-moderation induces sort of like a commitment problem or something. Specifically, like why wouldn't the state exploit its momentary advantage when it becomes relatively stronger as a result of the bandits self-limiting their extraction and hence their like kind of fighting capacity? And then the state uses that momentary advantage to repress the bandits to reduce their long-term losses, while the short-term profits that the bandits are accruing is also, you know, self-moderated. I don't, yeah, happy to kind of elaborate in Q&A more if that wasn't sufficiently clear. Third, I'm wrapping up here because I know time is sensitive. You know, fortification, bandits is a kind of big class of actors ranging from cartels and smugglers to like non-state militias in your framework. Fortification could be a boon to certain classes of those bandits and like a hindrance to other classes. And I'm thinking specifically of like coyotes and smugglers here, the sort of classes of bandits that specialize just in cross-border smuggling. They can charge a higher premium as fortification raises the risk of illicit crossing. So why wouldn't, you know, they prefer fortification to maximize their own profits potentially? And then last couple thoughts. So if I understand correctly, you're assuming a kind of constant cost of fortification irrespective of bandit type. The state pays like a flat fee for fortification. I was intrigued about what would happen if, you know, states could tailor the intensity and hence the costliness of fortification so that those costs are variable with type, right? Like you can imagine, okay, the state might put up a barbed wire fence along the border. That's pretty cheap. Or, you know, we could have like the US-Mexico border set up where there's an integrated surveillance network. You have towers, you have drones, you have like aerostat balloons, you have all sorts of stuff in addition to physical infrastructure blocking the barrier. And obviously like those costs are hugely different. And if the state could tailor the costliness of fortification based on its expectations of the type of the bandit, it seems like that would throw some interesting tweaks into your model. The last concluding thoughts here, probably like as you structure this for talks on the market and things like that, I would probably be inclined to put a case study in the paper and shift some of the result, like the extension results on violence rather than economic extraction and like the migration angle. And you also talk about like fascism briefly and like anti-migrant sentiment. Some of that stuff, you know, great to have in your back pocket in a job talk because someone might ask, and it probably fits in the appendix, but I don't necessarily see that it needs to be in the paper text itself. Also didn't necessarily agree with the characterization of migrants and refugees as a drain on state resources. I think most of the evidence out there suggests that they're a net benefit to the state. You know, by 17 years or something, they're like net contributors to taxes, and you know, the Uganda model for refugee hosting is all about integration and like leveraging the human capital of refugees as a kind of developmental boon. So that was just, you know, a sort of concluding thought, but really great paper. Excited to see it, you know, hopefully out in the world soon. And kudos to you for, you know, a solid job market paper, hopefully. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Martin, if you want to we'll download some of your comments.
Yeah, so amazing comments, Chris. Yeah, I just want to build on that. So I really like this work. I do believe that this, you know, border fences and especially kind of like organized crime related, in this case, it's like, I guess, transnational crime, is very under theorized in our discipline. So all of this work is very necessary. In that line, I do believe that kind of like, and this might be a matter of taste, personal taste, but like, I know that there's like a lot of like, you know, recent work, good work, particularly from Benjamin and Chris on border fences, empirical work. And I was wondering whether kind of like the theoretical framework that you have can speak a little bit more close, right? Or relate more closely to different, you know, empirical specifications and kind of like, you know, talk about different mechanisms that might be driving, right, the results that we see in those papers. So that kind of like we can build this kind of like synergy between theory and empirics more closely, right? I guess kind of like the burden of the work, especially for, you know, aspiring for young formal theories, is for us to go and try to engage with empirical work. And so like I would kind of like, and I know kind of like, I mean, I'm not very well versed in this literature, but I think kind of like, you know, there's a lot of like potential, right, for this model to be informing, you know, empirics and, you know, to be engaging with it. That's kind of like the first comment. Now going back to the moderation idea, and I want to build this on Chris. I know this is a model of border fence, but I also believe that this model is capturing more broader, you know, phenomena, right? So going back to the moderation idea, and this is like very particular case of like Mexican cartels. So like policy analysts and like experts on organized crime in Mexico, they all have been hinting that, for instance, Mexican drug cartels are terrified from being labeled as terrorist organizations by the U.S., you know, State Department, right? And that actually deters them from engaging in any violence, right, in the U.S. territory, right? So this is kind of like speaking very closely to kind of like the result that you have, right? And at the same time, you know, these Mexican kind of like drug cartels or criminal organizations more broadly, they have a lot of like potential for violence. They go to the black market, they get like very lethal weapons, right, and they fight very deadly wars on the other side of the border, right? So in a way, I think this result that you find, it's something that is an ongoing tension between Mexican drug cartels, right, and the U.S. State Department, where like, you know, we don't want to, you know, you have this kind of like, you know, nobody really knows how unstable this equilibrium is, right? But like they don't want to be labeled a terrorist organizations because, you know, the U.S. military can go after them. But at the same time, right, U.S. policymakers don't want to give them that label because maybe, you know, after that they can engage, you know, more likely to engage in violence in the U.S. side of the border. So I think there you have something that is like super relevant, super kind of like contemporary, and kind of like, you know, your model captures that dynamic super well. I do believe that, especially how the paper is framed, there should be like a welfare analysis. I wasn't clear in which parameter regions, which equilibria was more efficient than the other. As you know, especially because you want to provide kind of like normative assessment of which policies are efficient or inefficient. I think that's a natural next step. And also kind of like more on the theoretical kind of like details. I was wondering, so when I was checking the model, I didn't have like a complete picture of which assumptions were driving kind of like which results. Because, you know, you have a very complicated model in the sense that you have, you know, commitment problems because it's an infinitely repeated game. At the same time, you have, you know, uncertainty, right? So I was unclear, like, for instance, you know, if you remove all the uncertainty from the game, you might still have, you know, a commitment problem where, like, you know, any type, right, would like deter from you know, extracting everything today so that the border is not built, right? So the question is like, do you need uncertainty for that result? Also, I was wondering, you know, what if you make, you know, the model kind of like ends after 2 or 3 periods, right? I was wondering whether you can still have the same kind of like qualitative results. I think, you know, at least from a kind of like, as a reader, like I would like to have like that more digested throughout the paper. So like I have an idea of like which assumptions are driving which results. And yeah, I'll say that I'm hitting my 5 minutes. I have more comments in case there's more time, but I'll leave it like this for now.
Thanks, Martin. And we're doing just fine on time. So, all right, Ben, if you want to round us out.
Sure. Well, I think Martin and Chris have both done an excellent job in terms of, you know, framing the contribution. I think it's a sort of really nice paper as is. Plenty of room for growth in different directions, depending on, you know, how you choose to use the coming months. You know, coming from an economics perspective, I think I'll defer to the rest of the group on sort of where this fits in, you know, the political science literature, and focus my comments a bit more on what I know, which is particularly related to, you know, the U.S.-Mexico border setting and sort of, you know, similar smuggling environments like, you know, the North Africa to sort of Southern Europe corridor. So let me start out, you know, talking about the sort of single bandit environment that's your focus. And then, you know, free disposal, offer sort of more suggestions in the context of the model where you have multiple actors, since I think, at least for the environments I'm familiar with, that's a little bit of a better fit, and I'll talk about why. So I think, you know, in sort of the benchmark model, right, no collective action problem from the bandits' perspective. I think the predictions are, you know, nice, straightforward, intuitive. One framing thought that I had here is that, you know, I might think about allowing for some flexibility in the ex-ante extractive capacity of the different bandit types. So the way you framed it now, right, you talk about sort of the, you know, high type being more powerful, less deterred. And if I sort of interpreted the model correctly, really what's going to matter is the relative differences in deterrence effects across these groups, right? And so that comes entirely from the sort of post-fortification differences in extraction ability in your current setup, but it doesn't seem like that needs to be the case, right? It could really be about those differences pre versus post. One other thought I had, a bit related to Chris's comment, just in terms of sort of the framing, you know, how you might apply a case study, is that, again, in the settings I know best, you know, you mentioned sort of in passing in the paper that this idea of moderation is sort of isomorphic to the idea of obfuscation. And at least on the US-Mexico border, that struck me as particularly interesting, because I'm not sure there's as much moderation of sort of cross-border smuggling activity. There is a lot of, you know, effort put in, right, to avoiding confiscation. I think our typical understanding is that that's sort of purely short-term profit driven. But I think your model suggests that, you know, there's an additional benefit of tunneling or investing more in, you know, how to carry cartel goods over the border without being caught, right? And that's to prevent this sort of ex post responsiveness from the state. So that seemed like an angle you could push potentially a bit more. I thought the informational assumptions could use a little more discussion, right? So here there's this uncertainty about bandit type. Extraction levels are known with certainty. I think if you allowed uncertainty there in sort of the single bandit version of the model, I don't think, just from sort of, you know, briefly thinking through the implications, that's going to matter too much. But I think when you turn to the multiple bandit version of the model, it will. And in practice, you know, I think the way that extraction levels are revealed to the state is through some sort of sampling, right? So like you think about drug trafficking, you know, the state catches 10% of all drugs trafficked across the border and infers from that the overall level of extraction, right? And so in that sense, there is naturally this sort of noisiness in the signal received. I guess turning to the version of the model where there are these multiple bandit types, right? I think, you know, one comment is just when you're solving for the equilibria, it would seem to me there's a second class of equilibria you don't talk about where the collective action problem reemerges, right? All of the individual bandit actors are fully extracting, they'd collectively benefit, right, from self-moderation, but no one individual benefits once they're above that threshold. I think, because at least on the US-Mexico border, it tends to be the case that there are multiple actors. I could imagine devoting a little more time to this version of the model in the paper, and perhaps removing or moving to an appendix some of the other sort of additional material that comes at the end that Chris had referenced. One other thought here is that in terms of the information level, right, you're also assuming sort of the bandits know each other's extraction levels. It's not entirely clear that would be the case. And, in general, this sort of assumption of perfect information seems important because that's what gives you this sort of discrete change, right, in the cost of marginal extraction, because you go from no to perfect fortification. I think another way you could introduce some more continuity there would just be to allow for there to be more continuous investments, right? So a version of the model where, you choose what share of the border defense, how big the fence are going to be, how much supplementary patrolling there's going to be, all just sort of with a simple parameterization that's just allowing for some 0-to-1 investment. But just to say that it doesn't have to be sort of entirely discrete, and it would be interesting to know what the implications are if it isn't. I think one other thought I had is just related to sort of how you're framing future payoffs. And in particular, it struck me that the sort of value placed on the future is likely to be very different for bandits than it is for the state, right? And in particular, when you think about bandits, right? So, one, they don't know how long these rents are going to be available, right? So think about drug trafficking, if tomorrow the US, right, legalized, additional class of drugs, that's going to affect the profitability of that trafficking, even absent fortification, right? It's also the case that they don't know, when they're going to get cracked on domestically, when other cartels are going to come after them. And so I could just imagine that, they discount the future much more heavily than the state. It also may be the case that early extraction efforts, right, are actually going to strengthen them. So, when you accrue revenues up front, that allows you to pay for more foot soldiers, buy more weapons, and that in turn, right, makes it more likely that you survive into subsequent periods. And so I think that'd be something that would be interesting to grapple with. And then I guess one last comment, as an empiricist primarily, I'm always interested in sort of how to relate the work to, empirical evidence. And one thought I had is it would be interesting if you could say something about what the implications are with respect to the empirical evidence, right? So it seems like, your theory, if I'm thinking about it correctly, in some sense tells us that estimates of the efficacy of border fortifications, right, that are driven by these economic factors are going to be lower bounds, right, to the extent that, they're really underestimating the true deterrence effect, since there's the self-regulating ex ante. And so I think some engagement with that, and perhaps some discussion of, how important in practice you think these economic motivations might be relative to sort of the standard class of political economy channels would be interesting too, because that similarly, I think, helps inform sort of what that degree of underestimation would be in practice. Okay, that's what I had.
All right, great. Thanks, Ben. And so Chris, Martin, Ben, all excellent comments. So I have just one comment, because this is certainly sort of outside of my substantive area, but reading the paper, I think you do a really nice job of being sort of clear about what the mechanism in your theory is, but I think there's an alternative but close theoretical mechanism that could be operating, and I think it would be useful to sort of maybe address that and try to rule it out in some way. And I think this is where like a little bit more of a in-depth case study, like Chris suggested, could help. And in particular, I picked up on something that was similar to something Chris brought up, which is you allude to the fact that in Mexico, like there's a you give some evidence that there's a group and they're concerned about violence, right? And so I wonder if it seems like a plausible alternative explanation for what's going on is not really that it has anything to do with information per se, but rather that we're playing a game similar to a complete information version of yours, where we're just playing, an equilibrium with history dependent strategies, right? Where I'm limiting and off the path, potentially, I know that if I engage in violence, I'm going to be punished with a border wall built, right? And And that equilibrium like looks a lot like what happens in the various equilibria that you have, but the mechanism is different, right? It's in the equilibrium I'm suggesting, it would be sort of like if you wanted to get something really close to what you have, you might consider, a complete information version, and then you could I'm pretty sure you can construct like a non-stationary equilibrium where something like that happens, right? If we're really patient, then I limit myself so that I'm not punished. If I'm impatient, I extract a lot in the first period, knowing that I will be punished, right? And they're going to build the fortification. And so, like, to me, it seems like both of those mechanisms are pretty plausible. And in reality, I would assume that they probably one operates in some cases and one operates in another case, right? And so, sort of sorting those out and convincing us that like giving us some evidence that this informational explanation is really what's going on, I think would be really useful. And it also, like, it struck me as like some of the comparisons that you made like raised this question, because you compare some of the comparisons about, well, this is what a weak group would look like, or this is what a strong group would look like. And it seems like in many cases the government should be able to look at the group and sort of tell. I know it's a matter of degree, but sort of giving us some more information about like how the government actually has some real uncertainty, I think would be useful, because it's plausible to me that they would, but I think sort of helping the reader with, some additional case evidence would be super helpful. So that was the one thought I wanted to add. Okay, so it looks like we have about 15 minutes left. So Afiq, I'll turn it back over to you if you want to respond to any of the comments. And then I'll kind of let you guide the discussion. Just kind of help us know what would be most useful to follow up on. And with about 5 minutes to go, I'll try to wrap things up.
All right, thank you, Brad, and thank you, Martin, Chris, and Ben. I guess I'll loosely respond to some things that I have something to say about, and ignore the things I have to think more about for now. So I'll start with Chris's comment. Let's see. So your first comment was about what if it's difficult to tell apart both mechanically and substantively when bandit citizens operate quite similarly, right? So you might have a situation in which the state is really weak at the border, and therefore, whether it's the citizens operating in the economy or the bandits, the state can't tax it either way, or it can't benefit from it either way. And I think this is something like this used to be bigger in not this part of the paper, but a different part of my dissertation, where I like to talk about the border where I'm from. I'm from Malaysia, and we don't have many land borders, but we do have one with Indonesia, where once I've been there, and like as you walk towards the border, the language starts to change, right? It resembles a lot more the language across the border, and the products on the street also start to change. They resemble products that are made across the border instead of the ones made in Indonesia. So certainly I thought a lot about situations in which the bandits and citizens tend to blend, at least from the perspective of the state's economic interests. And I guess like the simple answer to this conundrum is that, well, in situations where citizens really resemble bandits economically, like the states are not benefiting at all from their economic activity, I guess then they are basically our bandits, right? Or maybe you might say they really are weak bandits from the state's perspective, because the state would need to invest lots of things in the borderland in order to be able to extract the economic fruits there for their own benefits. And so one might say that the state's outlook on that situation is actually very similar to them when they have to deal with lots of weak bandits, maybe. That's one way of dealing with that complication. There are probably also more complicated ways of dealing with that complication, which I have to think more about. But like that's like my immediate reaction to introducing that complexity. More extensive case study. This is something, of course, I would really, really want to do. The main problem I run into is that because this is a game where you have multiple possible outcomes, no single case study will satisfy my ability to tell you, hey, these are all the possible ways in which this game will turn out. So I have struggled into putting a case study in, especially for talk-based approaches. Like I used to have a longer talk where I would go over 3 different examples for each of the 3 different outcomes, and people hated it because it's so confusing. So yeah, as people who are, those of you who are much more experienced than I am, if you have a way of using case studies effectively, both in the paper and in talks, especially in situations where a single case study doesn't seem to satisfy because of the way the results work out. If you have advice on that, I'd be glad to hear it. But that's my main problems with that at the moment, in addition to also finding the strongest case studies, because I do compromise a lot with the ones that I currently use. let's see, the state taking advantage of the bandits as they are moderating. This is an interesting one. I have not thought about this, right? So if the bandits are moderating in the short term, does this give the state a short-term advantage to then press forward more intensive sort of control, more intensive border policies? I have not thought about this. This is actually quite interesting. Something, of course, in the model has to change to allow for some sort of advantage here, but that might be an interesting extension to try. I don't know what will happen. The bandits might charge a premium as the wall goes up. So this is actually, I think this has echoes in some of the other comments as well from everybody else. So this is actually one of the situations that motivated the design of this paper, right? So as someone pointed out, put it down in my notes, I made the decision to make it such that the advantage for the difference between two types of bandits is post-fortification, right? After the policy has gone out, I think Ben said this. But it doesn't have to be that way. I could have set it up that they're different beforehand. And one of the reasons I decided to make it that the differences between two bandits are afterwards is noticing things like Chris pointed out that sometimes maybe if the wall goes up, certain bandit types will gain an advantage because they can take advantage now of the more limited market. And these also differences are what motivated high types and low types. I did not model it with that much depth because I don't allow for prices to change and a lot more market dynamics. But that's certainly a direction that has motivated me, but I have not taken upon it yet because start off with a simple case first, but could be a very valuable direction. Variable K, so this is something both Chris and Ben brought up. Like, what if we allow for the state to choose a certain level of how much enforcement they do? The first reaction to this, particularly in a single bandit model, is that it doesn't matter too much because if you have a range of K, it eventually boils down to K star, right? The optimal choice and 0. So you end up with a binary choice at the end and again. So the one case it would matter is in the multiple bandit scenario, and that is where multiple Ks come into play. Interestingly, I do have it's not a model about bandits, but in a different paper, I do have a model where states do have variable K, this time responding to interstate dynamics instead. So how much enforcement they do. So it'll probably end up something like that. So I know it is possible, but it's not a complication I'm interested here yet. So could be interesting. And Chris's last comment was about refugees not being economic burdens to the state. And on that perspective, like I concur, right? So the idea of states of being refugees being economic burdens to the state is a shallow and naive perspective, but it is exactly that shallow and naive perspective that some citizens do have, and perhaps even if you look at it naively, some politicians do have. So it does not necessarily need to be true for me to use them as an application here that refugees are actually economic burdens. But so long as some people think that way, right? Some people look at the situation that way, that the model might apply, so regardless of economic reality. That's taken a long time, but I guess I'll just keep going this way and responding to comments. Martin, you mentioned on linking this more to the violence of and the reluctance to use violence. I think this is very interesting. I have not thought about this. As you've seen, like there is a small violence extension, which did come about from previous comments. Someone said like, hey, this looks really great if you can extend it to violence. And I thought, oh yeah, okay, I can apply it to violence. But Martin has brought up a lot more richness in that direction, which I am nervous to take on because I have no expertise in that direction, but it definitely sounds very interesting. Hopefully it can go somewhere eventually. Welfare analysis, this is a well-taken point. It is something I've neglected and something I've been trying to add. The problem with the welfare analysis is that a lot of the equilibria overlap in terms of where they are, in terms of possibility, and then they only vary in terms of welfare gains in certain areas. So the welfare analysis is actually boring, but I have to put it in there just because people keep asking about it. So it still needs to be in there, which I agree with. Which assumption drives which result? You are absolutely correct that you can take out the uncertainty and still end up with a moderation result. Because if you take out the uncertainty, the game ends up looking a lot like a repeated prisoner's dilemma, right? So where you get exactly, it looks a lot like a grim trigger strategy. So what you gain from the uncertainty really is the gambling aspect and the waiting and learning aspect. So as you correctly point out, maybe that should be much clearer in the paper. Ben's comments, if Brad will allow me the time. I've already talked a bit about the motivation between the ex-ante capacity. As you mentioned, avoiding confiscation. If bandits are working hard to avoid confiscation, I do think this sort of applies to the model, because if you are avoiding confiscation, then you are expanding resources to hide your activities. And this is somewhat economically equivalent to restraining yourself, right? Because you take out some of the profits you might have and investing into efforts to hiding. So I do see a sort of parallel there, and an application of my model exactly to the avoiding confiscation scenario. I don't know if that satisfies you, but it might be another application of my model. As you say, my multi-bandit extension is very fragile, and that's very well taken. I definitely agree that that's true. Whether I want to tackle all those complications in this paper or in a different paper, I'm not sure. But a lot of those ideas are definitely great directions. Should I stop there, Brad?
If we have, yeah, I mean, if there's anything specific you want to follow up on, I mean, we have about 3 or 4 minutes, so we can continue.
Yeah, I guess like the one point that I did throw back is that if anyone has like great ideas for case studies that I have not considered, or well, you don't know what I've considered, but if you have a really good idea for a case study, or if a good way of handling case studies particularly in this environment where I would maybe need multiple case studies in order to address all the different results, if anyone has any ideas in that front.
So I don't have an idea for a case, but just very quickly, I think with this type of paper, you mentioned like wanting to be able to explain the various outcomes. I think it's more important to be able to explain the mechanism and give us some evidence for the mechanism. So my suggestion would be, when you're looking at the case evidence, to as much as you can, try to find evidence for how the actors in the situation are thinking about what's happening, both quote on and off the path, right? Because I would find that pretty convincing. Like, so, for example, if you could find some evidence that a policymaker is, the smoking gun would be if you can find them saying, well, we're going to wait to build a fortification because we don't know whether it's worth it, because we don't know whether they're strong or weak. Like that's like, now you're probably not going to be able to find that, but I think that would be my suggestion about how to orient yourself towards looking at the cases, because that would be more convincing to me personally than matching all the outcomes, right? It's sort of matching the strategic logic that is implied by the model. But others likely have a.
I would just totally two-finger the cases for mechanisms point. I think that's a great idea. And I mean, in principle, you could pick a country that has, fortified some but not all of its borders in response to, different sorts of bandits present on one border versus others, and like use that maybe to gain some greater control over some of the other dimensions that you might be worried about. But the mechanism piece, I think, is key from Brad.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
that's a great direction for me to look at. So,
all right, well, we're almost at time, so we should probably wrap up. I want to thank Afiq first for presenting this like excellent paper. I agree with the panelists. I'm looking forward to seeing it out in the world. I also want to thank Chris, Martin, and Ben for the really thoughtful comments. It's clear that you all spent a lot of time with the paper, and I think offered to pick some really useful suggestions. So for those of you out in the audience in the world or watching on YouTube later, we have one more session of the Online Peace Science Colloquium this semester, and it in fact happens to be today in about 3 hours. So we're going to have Susanna Campbell, Yolande Buca, and Travis Curtis presenting Who Makes the State? National Ownership and International State Building in Authoritarian Contexts. Chelsea is going to be hosting that one at 2 p.m. Central Time today. And also make sure that you keep a lookout for the call for papers for next semester. That should be going out in the next few days. So until next time, take care.
thank you, everyone.